Hi, my name is Suzi Hunn.
What do you do?
So I'm self-employed as an instructional designer.
Will you tell us about your journey?
Well, I have always known that I wanted to do something altruistic, and I started out as an editor, actually. I was an English major in college, and I also loved business. I was a business minor, and my first job out of college, I was an editor at a publisher, and from there moved to an editing role at a larger publisher, then ultimately moved to a major museum, and I was an editor of a textbook there. And from there became a teacher educator and created all kinds of curricular materials, from live trainings for teachers to high level materials for state history curricular materials that were used in every county of the state by sixth graders to teach required mandates. And those were to teach required mandates in social studies instruction. And then from there, I wanted to become a business owner and started to surround myself with other entrepreneurs and change my mindset. And then started finding other client work as an instructional designer. And the funny thing is, when I worked at the museum, we always called ourselves educators. We didn't call ourselves instructional designers. It wasn't until I left my job, where I had worked happily for almost 15 years, that I realized that what I had been doing faithfully for years and years was called instructional design. And so that's actually a relatively new revelation to me. And once I was able to use that term, it opened up a lot more doors for me than I had previously realized, even though the skill sets are exactly what I've been using all along.
What are those skill sets, Suzi? What do new instructional designers need to cultivate?
Well, what I like to tell people is to say, here's a subject matter expert over here, and here's the learner. And there's a whole journey that needs to happen from here to here. So I have the skill of being able to learn enough from that instructional designer about who their audience is. And one of the things that I always say is, if you're going to change behavior, which ultimately is what instructional design is all about, you need to know and love your audience. So one of the first steps from getting from here to here is learning a whole lot about this audience. So you do the analysis phase and find out, what are the audience's needs? Where are they today? What do they want to learn? What are their barriers to learning? So really get to know the audience first. And then from there, you get to a design process where you plan what's going to be taught. And that's when you determine what the learning objectives are. And specifically, that means what behaviors you're hoping to change. And so that's where you plan out the length of the experience. And that, for example, is something that may not sound important, but especially in a K-12 environment where I was working for a long time, that's a big deal. Because if you plan some experience that would take an hour, but realistically the school only had a half hour in between two other class periods, you would be dead in the water before you even started if you didn't really know the time frame that was realistic. So that's one of the things that you do in the design phase, is figure out the length of the experience, what needs to be taught, the format that will work best and meet the learner where they are. Then you develop. And so that involves a lot of writing and storyboarding. So that is a process where you're actually taking the content and breaking it down and explaining it to the audience in a way that's accessible to them. And through all of these steps, there's often a back and forth between you and the subject matter expert, because almost every time, without fail, the subject matter expert knows so much about their content that it's hard for them to remember what it was like to not know it. And it's often people who The one way I like to say it is that there's an art and a science to whatever it is that that person knows and does really well. And so you're often the person who's getting the subject matter expert to explain things in a way where to them it's an art because it feels natural. Either it felt natural to them all along, or more likely they have learned things that have become natural. And so your job is to learn how to break it into steps and distill the content down, because usually the subject matter expert wants to teach this and you need to get it to this because that's what the learner can digest. So anyway, so that happens during the development phase where you're actually, it happens more during the design phase, and then during development you're actually writing it and scripting it out. And then you do a lot of feedback back and forth, and ideally you're working with designated members of your audience all the time so they can be giving feedback at every single step. And then you get to the E phase. By the way, I'm describing an ADDIE model. So analysis, design, development, implementation. I was skipping E earlier. So implementation means you actually deliver the content. So whether that is a live training or an online course, the instruction actually occurs. And then E is evaluation. So you then evaluate, did the objectives get taught in the way that you were hoping? And from there, you gather information and pivot as needed. So if you can't tell, another of the main skills that you need as an instructional designer is knowing how to listen, because that's a lot of what you do. You really have to listen to the subject matter expert. You also have to listen to the audience. And so that's one thing. Another skill is putting pieces together and seeing patterns and discerning what's the most important thing for people to know. And being organized and having good planning skills is helpful, as is writing. So those are all skills. Oh, and another skill that is absolutely critical for an instructional designer is curiosity, because at least in my experience, you get to encounter all different subjects. I mean, I've taught classes on topics that range from Ojibwe lifeways through the eyes of an Ojibwe beadworker, all the way to a corporate franchise class teaching people how to do eyebrow shaping in a professional studio, and lots of other things in between. So you have to really enjoy learning about some topic that you never had any contact with. And I think that curiosity is what allows you to become enough of an expert that you can translate it into teaching it. But it's also good that you come to it from a cold perspective, because then you know what it feels like not to know that thing, and you know which questions to ask in order to understand. So you also have to be humble, because you have to constantly ask questions and sometimes just say, okay, explain this to me again, because I still am not understanding this one piece here, which I think is a good thing, because ultimately whatever you struggled with to learn, chances are very good the learner will struggle too, and that helps you know better how to guide the learner. So those are some of the skills that jump out to me right off the bat.
Something's a complete answer. There's so much in there to unpack from what you just said. And one thing that we have been talking about in class is it okay? Are you feeling good with this?
I am good. I forgot though to focus on the camera, and I started looking at you, but I'm good.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
I look to, I can see, it looks to me as if you're looking at me. So
great.
We're talking about content wrangling.
Content wrangling.
And dumps of information.
Yep.
And would you say what your personal tips and techniques are for handling something like that?
So I think what you mean is either a team of people or a single person has just said, like, here's a folder and we've got this old training that we developed 3 years ago in one document, and we've got an interview with a person in this one document, and we've got some webinars from 2 years ago that before we rebranded this other document. Here it's all together. I'm thinking of a specific project, as you might be able to tell, as I talk about that. I would say that's always helpful to start because it gives you a chance to see the project from different perspectives. So in the case I'm talking about, this was a corporate training for employees. And the organization was going through some major cultural shifts. And so that's why there was this hodgepodge of, well, we taught this way 3 years ago, but now we teach it this way, and for example. So it's useful to have the content dumps in some ways because you get to learn about the history that got us where we are now, which definitely helped in conversations that you had with the team. Because another thing I would say is instructional design is ultimately about making tough decisions. That's what happens at every stage. Usually the decisions are about what not to include. And so when those debates come, because they always do, that's where you can go back to the dumps and ask questions, and you have more perspective about the history of a project as you're asking those questions. But it also can be frustrating if you don't have a single person or really committed team to help you sift through it and answer a lot of questions. So I guess for me, the content dump isn't, in and of itself, isn't good or bad. I think for me, what makes it good or bad is the willingness and readiness of your designated subject matter experts to be available to you and enjoy the process of sharing about it. That, to me, is what makes or breaks my happiness on a project, more than how I receive the information.
Is what the attitude and relationship of the people who owned it is?
Exactly. That's what I find to be the most critical factor at every step.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Will you talk about a project where you didn't have enthusiasm on the part of the...
Sure. Well, I'll give, I hope this makes sense. One of them was technically a project and one wasn't, but I had 2 employers in a row who essentially had the same role. They were both wealth managers. One of them was a part-time job that I was working at actually while I was transitioning to become self-employed. I wanted some hours that would be consistent pay while I was building my business. So I was working part-time at a wealth management company that was a single female owner. And I was like, this is going to be fun because she's going to teach me about the finance industry, even though I was not going into the finance industry, but I felt that personally it would help me to learn about it. And I also thought that she would be excited to teach me about how to be a business owner. But as it turned out, she was more introverted, and that's not to say that introverts can't be great partners on teams, because they can. But what I realized after working there for a few months was she did not enjoy the process of teaching about what she knows. And I ended up not staying there as long because of that. I felt like it made me realize how much collaboration is an important part of the culture that I come from. And I realized, not everyone has that same kind of collaborative spirit. Then fast forward to now, one of my first clients on an instructional design project is a wealth manager. So the reason this example came to my mind is that even though one of them wasn't technically an instructional design project, I was in a position with 2 people from the same industry who had an opportunity to teach me what they know, and one of them just did not enjoy the process of teaching, and the other one loves it. And he has a natural spirit as an educator, and I've learned more in just a few weeks from the second person than I did in several months working every day with the first person. And so that was really what taught me the importance of being on a team with a collaborative spirit. So, and even though I'm telling a story about individuals, the team that surrounds this individual on the project that I'm working on now has been very collaborative, and I think it's going to be a really powerful experience for the learners because of it.
What do you do? What are some techniques for working with SMEs when you don't have that enthusiasm? I know that you are out on your own and you can choose what projects you want.
Well, but not entirely, because as a self-employed instructional designer, my income comes in a few ways. One is I can get clients directly, and in that case, I've learned to put out there the type of person I'm looking for, and I say, here's how the process works best, is if it's very collaborative and back and forth. But I also earn income by being a contractor with larger agencies that hire contract instructional designers. So they find the clients, and then they'll pick from their pool of contract instructional designers who to put on each project. So I don't always get to choose the teams. And let me think. So far, I've been really lucky. Most teams I've worked on, I would say if there's a problem, it's a good kind of problem in that everybody on the team actually cares about it a lot. And I would say more than having to draw people out, the biggest challenge, actually the bigger challenge, is having to deal with the fact that everybody has an opinion and everyone's super passionate, which is great. But I think in that sense, it can be harder to make decisions. So in that case, you learn to either, depends on what the role, it helps for you to know what are the roles on this project. And so usually there's a project manager. So it's a matter of asking that project manager, okay, when the debates come, who's going to make the call on this decision? And sometimes I'll be the project manager. So in that case, when I can feel people starting to spin, I'll say, okay, there are certain things that we can cover in this meeting, but we've got 15 minutes left of everyone's time, and this is valuable. So who would like to volunteer to take the lead on this, to lead a smaller discussion and get back to us offline after the meeting? Who's going to take the lead right now? And sometimes you just have to call on their team to find, so that's often what I'll just say is, can I find a volunteer to take the lead on this? And I found that strategy to be really helpful.
How did you develop, that's a great meeting facilitation skill. How did you develop this kind of skill, and what other skills would you put under that umbrella?
I developed that through being a museum educator. So the major museum that I worked at for 15 years had large teams. There wasn't anything I worked on that didn't have a large team. So it was not at all unusual to be around a conference room table that had 20 people sitting around it. So I think that's where I developed such a comfort level with collaboration. And I 100% believe in the power of teams. I think that together we create something better than if we were working on our own. And that's another thing I'll say, if any of you are considering becoming self-employed, there is a perception out there that people who are self-employed are just sitting quietly by themselves all day and it's lonely. But in fact, you can't succeed as a business owner, at least in my experience, unless you are out with people at least 50% of the time, finding clients, working with clients, finding partners. So I would say my museum education experience actually prepared me very well for being a business owner, because I'm used to a lot of in and out and a lot of opinions. So you also asked what skills go along with that. I think another critical one is just valuing different people's personalities. I think early on in my career, I was more thrown off by people who weren't like me, because I'm really passionate about things and I'm somebody who really wants to dig in. And most of the people I've worked with have always been that way. But it wasn't until later in my career that I started to recognize the value for examples. So for example, I am an optimist, and I'm generally the person on a team who sees the possibility. And there are other people whose personalities are the people who see the practical realities, and they'll be the first to point out what might go wrong. And earlier on in my career, I would undervalue that, and I'd be like, oh, come on, don't you see it? Why are you always trying to hold us back, man? And I realized over time, those people are really valuable too, and I started to not judge the different roles and see that there's the value in the person who sees the problems, because they'll help us be more practical, and there's value in the person who has the vision. And so don't hold back your vision either, because that's a part of the process too. So I would say just learning to deal with different types of people and knowing when to advocate for something and knowing when to hold back is something that you can only learn it by doing it. And so I will always tell you, in instructional design, as a business owner, and in life, I want you to know, let go of any perfectionism. If you are someone who would label yourself as a perfectionist, I am going to tell you, let that go. Let it go now, because I have learned that, and I believe very wholeheartedly, that perfectionism is an invitation to be silenced. At worst, I think that it leads to a lot of social justice imbalances, but on a more benign level, I think it's just a way for any individual to hold themselves back and not take part in something. And instructional design requires that you put something out on the table so people can respond to it. And if you're getting caught up in trying to craft this perfect thing before the team sees it, or before the client sees it, or before the audience sees it, you'll never get anything out there. So I would say another skill to cultivate is get comfortable with creating something that is like a minimum viable product that people can see and respond to. Because when you start to talk like finger shadows on a wall, that was a terrible example, but you'll spin and waste a lot of time. So whatever the format is, whether it's a storyboard or a sample video or a web page that has a wireframe on it, whatever the format is, put something into it and get people to respond sooner in the process rather than later, I would say is another, and that's a skill you have to learn if you're like me and you're a perfectionist.
This whole video so far has been like all awesome sound bites.
Well, excellent. I love talking about it.
I think you've already talked to this a little bit, but if you could just say it out in a sentence, what ID and ID related roles have you played? And then, no, I don't want that one. Okay. How much does industry and discipline matter to what type of training you have designed?
Industry and discipline, do you mean for myself or for the learner, or?
Like, what do you make differently depending on different contexts and different disciplines?
Oh, are you talking about in terms of money, income generation?
No. In terms of what type of e-learning you would design.
Oh, okay. So let me think about this. What I have found, well, one thing I would say is, one pattern I've noticed is that in industries, one of the things that people will pay for is employee trainings. So I would say when I left the museum world, I didn't really know what kind of instruction was happening and where you could get jobs. But employee training, corporate employee trainings are one of those areas. So I think that's a good thing. And so one thing that is helpful is to find the joy in training employees, because on the surface, it might sound like employee trainings are dull, and that, I guess I'll give you my own perception. I used to be really passionate about teaching about other cultures and about civic dialogue, and as a social studies educator, there were a lot of sexier topics to me. and an employee training might have sounded boring. But I've really shifted that since I've moved out into the industry. So my first gig outside of the museum was actually a full-time learning experience designer job working for a corporate franchise. And I found that I really loved teaching franchisees because these were people who were business owners who had taken their own risk to start businesses, and yet they were part of a system where there were some commonalities, but yet here these owners had their own personalities. And that was really fun. And I've also come to see on the other side of it, when I'm a new employee, if I'm at a company that doesn't train me, I don't feel motivated. I feel lost. There's jargon that is unfamiliar to me. And I've really come to be passionate about training employees. And now I think if there's a company that's paying to hire somebody to create some corporate training that sounds boring, actually, those are good companies to work for. Or, I mean, you can't say that in a blanket way, but generally I think that's a good sign for a company, because a lot of companies wouldn't bother, or they would cut that out of their budget. So if you can find a love for employee trainings, I think that might open up experience for you in industry or corporate gigs.
I had never thought of it like that. So, but sometimes the content is super boring, right?
I would say there's a spectrum, and this is where curiosity comes into it. Surprisingly, I can't think of a single job where I didn't come to think that the content was interesting, and it surprised me. But there is a spectrum. Certain topics really just get you psyched, and other topics you're like, well, I'm glad you're teaching your people this, and I'm glad you're supporting them, but it doesn't keep me up at night. But even in those cases, I've still found interesting parts about it. So, for example, one of the trainings I'm working on now, there's a team that, and this is through I'm trying to think how to say it, the company that hired me as a contractor, so it's not my direct client. There is a corporation that, I'm hesitating to say it because I don't know if I don't want to reveal too much about the clients, I guess, but it's more of an industrial process. I'll say that. And at first I thought it sounded kind of boring, but then now I'm learning about, well, I never thought about that. And when I see something related to that industry, I think about what would it be like to be that person who's doing this everyday thing that I wouldn't have ever thought about, and how many steps go into this industrial process is actually kind of fascinating in a weird way. And so I haven't found any project yet that hasn't become interesting to me in some way. So that's one thing that I think is great about being an instructional designer.
And then the eyebrow shaping, free lesson.
Exactly. It's true. Now, granted, I need to get them updated, but I do have better eyebrows than I did before that class. It's true.
These need to be updated.
Yeah, I know. I feel almost embarrassed saying it, but before I went to that, I never cared about my eyebrows. But now I notice people's eyebrows more.
Of course. You've already given such great advice for skills that IDs need to hone, including working on teams.
For sure.
How about working with, can you say a little bit more about working on teams and how to juggle subcontractors and the different people who are doing all the different moving parts, and how to manage all that?
Well, it's funny because the first thing that comes to my mind is just a tiny little thing. But first of all, I will say I've gotten used to being on Zoom calls or interactive video conferencing. That's something that happens so much more since I've gone freelance. I'm on Zoom with a big team a couple of times a week. And so one thing, and again, this sounds little, but so for example, there's a team of 20 people that I'm working on where they're regional managers and people are calling in from all different time zones, and there's all these people on the list in the call. And so one thing I do, and that I'm conscious of, because I'm one of the few people who's not employed at the organization, sometimes you have the opportunity when you log into the video call to type in your name. And so I type in my name, and then I put the company that I work for and my role. So I'm like, I'm the writer on the project, just because that was the first time I was being introduced to this team. And I noticed it as I was on the call. It frustrates me when other people don't think that way. Not that I expect them to, but you look at all these names and you're like, I don't know who any of these people are. People would have no clue who I am, and there are all these voices coming in. So that's just a little thing, but I would say anything you can do to just think of what it's like for the other person to encounter you. Another thing that's related to that is I'm a big proponent for always having a photo in the little slot on a Zoom call, because I've noticed different teams have different cultures, and a lot of teams don't have a photo, but I personally think that's a little unprofessional. I just feel like, and I also just so value communication and warmth, and that's part of my personality. But I think if you're working on a team, you want to know what that other person looks like and who they are, and it just helps. It helps me orient to how we're all working together. So those are small things. Other things about how to work on a team where you have multiple people coming in and out. I think it's important to be direct and to sometimes just come right out and say things and just say, so refresh my memory on this, because I'm coming in cold after a week on working on other projects. I want to make sure that I'm understanding this, or let me make sure we're all on the same page here. So I'd say one thing is, as a subcontractor, you are constantly juggling, say, 3 different projects and 3 different teams and different time zones in a single day, and it can get disorienting. I have to admit it. So I have learned to just be very direct and just say, I want to make sure that I'm on the same page on you as this, and here's what I'm hearing, is that correct? Or like knowing what documents are available or what version of a document we're working on can get confusing, because say some of the people have been meeting and there's a new document since yesterday, and the last version you saw was the day before, or whatever. I think it's always a good practice to just check in and say, so I'm looking at a document right here dated this day, this time. Is that the same document? Those are just examples, but the whole point is, don't be afraid to be direct. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And sometimes you need to give a brief but succinct. I wasn't being brief or succinct as I said that sentence. Just give a brief explanation about why you're asking. Sometimes is helpful, just to give people perspective.
How often do you think it's necessary to check in with the group?
Oh.
If
I'm like the project manager or the lead.
How often?
Well, here's one thing I've learned. I believe over communication is better than under communication. And my initial reaction is coming from projects where I was responsible for a huge team and I was actually in-house, especially in that case. Sometimes I would get, your instinct is to feel frustrated about, here I am just typing another email instead of doing the real work. But after a while, I learned, this is the work. The process of communicating with people is as important, if not more, as actually doing the writing or the creation. And the sooner you can embrace that part of it, I think it's going to become a lot more enjoyable for you. Because what I have found in teams is that if the longer they go without information, people start to invent it or they start to get frustrated. And so if people just know what's going on and they feel like they're being heard, it can make a project go so much smoother. So that's but you can tell I like to talk to people. I like interacting with people. So that is partially my personality, but I also do think that it helps a project be successful. So that being said, I'm thinking about projects where I am just a subcontractor and I just come in for very brief parts and then I'm out. In those cases, it's a little bit different where it's good to sometimes hold back and let the people who are the lead make sure that they're doing their job and just communicate what you need to communicate. So this is a really good question. This is going to sound like I'm contradicting what I just said. But okay, so the first example was when I'm in charge of a big team, I still would stand by what I just said. But the other example is if I'm just a subcontractor who's coming in and there's a large team who's already doing their work, one thing I've learned from that first situation when I'm leading the project is how much it costs to have that person in the room. So if you've ever heard people say that employees are the most expensive part of a project, I learned that when I got higher in the ranks at the museum and actually saw how that's true. And one thing I learned is, whoa, if we have 20 people in a meeting, this is an expensive meeting. There are a lot of people here. So that actually changed my perspective a little bit about being a participant in a meeting where I try to be prepared before the meeting starts, know what to ask and how to ask it quickly, because you can tell I can be a little on the long-winded side, and recognize and be respectful of people's time, because you often don't have more than 20 minutes or a half an hour. So when you're just a subcontractor, I think it's okay to not feel like you have to control the whole project. And that's something I had to learn because I was used to controlling a whole project when I was in-house. So you kind of learn to figure out and adapt to whatever role you're playing.
I love this so much. So the roles that you've mentioned, writer, editor, project manager, what else is there?
Another role which I have not personally played is the articulate or storyline. Those are typical tools anyway, but the developer. So the one who actually takes the content and puts it into the e-learning tool specifically. That's one thing that's important, and I know that because I actually don't have that skill set. And at least, well, no, I'll say once, I had an instructional design gig where the person who was doing the hiring said, let me just tell you this, if you have development experience, it's going to increase your ability to get hired. And right now, those people are always in demand. And so that was something I was aware of and still am, that that's just not in my skill set yet. And so I'm probably not available for as many jobs. That being said, I haven't had any problem getting work so far as a writer. As a writer, as an editor, as a project manager, those seem to all be very much in demand as well. So one particular skill for writers is to pitch yourself as someone who can be warm and accessible. And I know that alone has gotten me at least one job, if not more. And that was kind of a delight to me because that's what I do naturally and that's what I enjoy. So when I found out that it's actually a sought-after skill set, I was actually really happy about it. Another skill set that's been helpful is to be good at noticing details. Back in my early days in my career, I was a copy editor, which meant that I could find, really tiny errors that other people missed. And that's another skill too, that there's a step of the process that's the QA, quality assurance step. And sometimes they'll put me on a project just to do the QA part. And that also is delightful to me because I find it kind of easy. It's like, oh, all I have to do is find things that don't seem right, and it comes naturally to me, and I can't believe I get paid to do that sometimes. But so if you're eagle-eyed, that's also a skill that really is sought after in the business world as an instructional designer, for sure. Amazing. I would also say, just in general, being adaptable is a skill in and of itself. And that has become very clear to me since making the transition to being self-employed. So like one day they'll stick me on a project as a project manager because I have the confidence to step into a team and lead. Now that came after many years of doing it in a nonprofit major museum environment, but it's a skill set nonetheless, and it's one that I can get thrown on one day. And then I also have an introverted side, so I can just sit by myself and write for hours. And so some days I get to do that. And like I said, sometimes I'm doing quality assurance. So an ability to be adaptable, I would say, is critical to an instructional designer. Maybe other people have different opinions about that. I think you probably could specialize and just do one thing over and over, but my experience hasn't been that way. My experience has been, they need you for this right now, so switch gears and do that. But if you're a multi-potentialite or you're somebody who likes a lot of variety, instructional design for sure is a way that you can find that in a career.
Be an instructional designer listening to you.
I really like it. I think you get to meet all different kinds of people. You learn about industries you never would have known about. You learn about weird nooks and crannies of processes. Plus, I really believe that education changes the world. And that's why I'm doing it as a business owner. So there are the jobs that I get hired to do through other clients, which bring me income, and I find joy in it. But it's different than the clients I'm looking for as for my business. I'm trying to attract social enterprises. So I'm looking for people who can bring together my past love, which was very mission-based, with my new love, entrepreneurship, which is saying it's okay to want to make money. And what about if I could do both at the same time? And I fundamentally believe education changes the world. And so I am actively seeking ambitious people who have a subject matter, who know a certain topic, and they have an idea for how to make people's lives better, and they have to teach what they know in order to do it. And I'm finding people all the time who are doing that, who fit that category, and that's my way to contribute to making the world better, because there's so many problems out there, and it can be heartbreaking when you're reading Facebook every day about what's happening in the world. So I have had to learn that I can only choose what I'm really good at. I can't fix all the problems in the world. But you know what I can do? I can use my education skills to be an advocate and a light for other people's knowledge to get disseminated and change people's behavior for the better. And that's what I love about it.
Do you have anything else you'd like to say about instructional design as leadership?
Sure, absolutely. And I will say this. After almost 15 years at this museum where I worked, which for more than a decade, I loved it. My whole narrative always was, I love my job, I love the people I work with, I love this museum. Those things are all still true. But there came a time in my career when the hierarchy was more important than the individuals. Or if that's on a bad day, I might say that. On a good day, I would say there wasn't enough room in the hierarchy for the incredible committed people who were there. And I just started to look ahead, and I realized I'm going to be in a stasis for the next 10 years. And that's when I had to do some digging deep to figure out what my next phase was going to be. And at the time, I had started a blog. I had been blogging for 3 years, and that lighted a fire in me and helped me refuse to live small in other ways. And that's how I started surrounding myself with entrepreneurs. And just that was an interest area of mine. And now I have this whole stack of books at my house all about purpose-filled entrepreneurship. I started listening to podcasts about that. And this does have a point. This is through all of that deep thinking, I slowly over time, over the period of about 3 years, started to really figure out what is it that I can bring that's outside of this same environment where I'd been working. Because I'll tell you, I believed, and so did many of my coworkers, that there was nothing for us outside of this museum. And we said it all the time. We'd be like, I don't know where I'd work if I wasn't working here. And that's a terrifying feeling if you are starting to realize that it's not where you want to be. And if you believe that, it's very limiting, but I did. And so it took me a while to reframe my thinking. And what happened was I ended up getting a job that pulled me out of it. And it wasn't until after I left that I saw how powerful my skill sets were. And I started to realize, you know what? Try to name any business initiative or any social movement that doesn't have education. It doesn't exist. And so educators are valuable. I had grown up believing that educators would never get paid well, that they shouldn't get paid well. They seem to be undervalued in so many areas of life. But what I've realized since that, and recognizing that I'm an instructional designer, I have come to see that, in fact, this is a very necessary and needed skill. And so I absolutely think instructional designers are leaders, because behavior change is critical if the world is going to change. So if you're going to make the world better, or if you're going to make money, and I think both of those can be good things, people have to change behavior. So instructional designers are leaders. So I'm being repetitive now, but I really believe in this, and I hope you know that what you're training to do is important and can affect a lot of people.
We have just a few minutes left. I want to ask you 2 more questions.
Okay.
One is, will you tell, actually 2 more questions after that.
Okay.
So they're both like, tell me a story about the project you're most proud of and the most difficult project, and then anything else you would like to tell a story about.
Okay. Well, the project I'm most proud of came from my work at the major museum, and it was very dear to my heart. I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society, and we created the curriculum that was used to teach required benchmarks in Minnesota Studies instruction at the 6th grade level. So that was a huge effort that involved government officials because you were following state standards. It involved many, many staff members in every aspect of the institution. It involved industry professionals, historians, reading specialists, designers, infographics people. And I was the project manager of the revision of that curriculum. So over the course of 4 years, we had 110 contributors that we hired. And I know this because I hired them all and managed their schedules and paid them. But what made me the most proud was when we finally finished the project, we were writing the acknowledgments page, and so we had to do an exercise where we wrote down all the names. And I didn't realize until that it was about 110 people, and that's not counting the staff. Probably that doubles if you count the staff. But what made me the most proud, it actually brought me to tears when it happened, was I knew every single one of those 110 people by name because I had worked with every one of them. And I knew what they had produced. I knew what they had given to the project. I had listened to them, and it was better because of it. So that's my most proud accomplishment, and it was the hardest. In fact, there are still pieces of me that got shredded and left behind because of that project. And it taught me a lot about, now I'm better at taking care of myself, because honestly, I gave everything to it. And it really was destructive in many ways too. So there's a balance between throwing something into a project you care about, but also really maintaining your own self-care. And I'm better at that now. And so that leads me to what I'm excited about now, which is building my own business. I think the name I'm playing with now is called Teach Your Thing. And so I think my tagline is going to be change the world, teach your thing. And I'm just excited about that because I get to find these ambitious people who have something that they can share and help them catapult into broader arenas where they can make a difference. So that I'm excited about, and it also allows me to choose how I spend my time. So right now, a non-negotiable for me is taking care of myself and taking walks every day and taking breaks, which I wasn't always able to do in a corporate or nonprofit setting, and now I can. So that's one thing that I'm especially excited about. Being able to control my own time and talent is where I want to be in my life right now. Even though it's more of a risk, I find it to be very healing in some ways. It can be anxiety producing, but you know what? So can being powerless at a large organization. So I think it just depends on what you're looking for. I've experienced the best in both worlds. But for now, I'm just most excited about self-employment and seeing where it can expand my horizons and bring me in contact with new people.
Can someone go straight from this certificate program into private enterprise like you've done?
Oh, I would be surprised if they couldn't, because I don't have a certificate. You guys have more skills than I do, I would imagine. I think in terms of being trained as an instructional designer, I don't know. I mean, I've been doing instructional design, but I never learned instructional design in school. I did it all on the job. So of course, I would be shocked if you couldn't. So I think a lot of it is believing in yourself and showing examples of what you have done, and not thinking you're not good enough. Get yourself out there and get all the experience you can. So yeah, I would just encourage you to put yourself out there. I think you can. If I can do it, you sure can.
What final piece of advice do you have for instructional designers, or what last thing would you like to tell us?
Well, this is kind of a weird story, but it just popped into my head. And it's a symbol of what I think you can do if you believe in yourself and get out of your comfort zone. So that's what I'll say. I think one of the major parts of my story is that I lived in a comfort zone for almost 15 years, and it was wonderful, and I loved it, and I learned so much. And actually, even in that comfort zone at this museum, we were always doing different projects. I was learning something new all the time. So my main message is put yourself out of your comfort zone and try to get used to the feeling of growth, because sometimes growth can feel scary, but you can also expand your world. So here's a funny story about that. So it took me a long time to shift my mindset, specifically around money and around opportunity. So my story was, I had worked around all these nonprofit employees, and we all were just like, we're educators, we're choosing mission over money, which is great, and I love these people for it. But when I started to get into my 40s and I started to look ahead and realize I wanted to at least have more of a shot to have more of an impact on the difference I made and in income generation, I had to retrain myself, and I read this book about how to change your mindset around money. And so I wrote this list of new truths around money. And one of the things was, people who have money can be do-gooders, and educators are just as valuable and worth making money as everyone else. And so I had all these I was like training myself and training myself. And a weird thing that happened is one of my very few first jobs that came as a self-employed person, so this was easily within my first 3 months as an instructional designer, I ended up working for a wealth advisor, and less than 6 months after writing my new truths about money and trying to convince myself of these things, I ended up working for a gentleman who's super wealthy and also is a total do-gooder. Like, this guy is committed to helping everyday people. And not only did I get to ride on a private jet to go to a meeting, which is not about the private jet, it's not about materialism, but for me it was a symbol of what could happen in my life if I opened myself to new experiences. And here I met someone that never would have been in my circle at all, who showed me that, guess what, people with money can be very good-hearted, and I got to have an experience I never would have had otherwise. And it's just a symbol, it's just an example, but if you apply that little story to other things, who knows what you could encounter if you allow yourself to go out of your comfort zone. So that would be my final message to you, is get comfortable with growth.